Well, welcome to the Razor Sharp Midweek Review. This is Sharon Farbros, and I've got with me at the moment Gerrit Halavka on my right, Dr. Ken Kogel from Monash University on my left, and I've got Matthew McGowan, who is the National Assistant Secretary of the NTEU. Gentlemen, let's look at it. We've got a government in crisis at the moment. We've got the Turnbull government pretty much on the run, attempting to some would say, like, railroad us into an election, an early election, brought on by a trigger, which is of course, the ABCC, a bash at the unions in order to bring on an early election. Now, we're seeing that there's some processes here that we need to look at, and also to, is this trigger not also an emergency to salvage the Liberal Party? Will it salvage the Liberal Party in this up-and-coming election in 2016? This is the issue. Dr. Ken Kogel, governance at Monash University, we've discussed a number of governance issues. The process that's being used in terms of the trigger that is to bring a snap election, how successful do you think this will be? Will the public swallow this? Have they swallowed the stories at the moment concerning the unions? And will it give victory to the Liberal Party?
Well, what we've seen is a very principled stance by the Senate that they are not prepared to pass this dreadful ABCC legislation. And so we've got this panic, I suppose, by Turnbull to rush to the polls before his own popularity drops even further, and whilst he thinks that he's got a chance of the government winning the election. But the reality is that the polls are not that good for the coalition at all, and Labor is certainly within striking distance of winning. And Labor is really doing very well when you look at the policies that they've been putting out. Over 70 policies already versus 2 or 3 differences between Turnbull and Abbott.
Yes, well, we're seeing there that, the ALP has seized leadership, has seized the agenda, have been able to crash in on the budget, lay the budget on the table. That's something that we've found that in this election process and prior to the election process that the Turnbull government has been negligent in doing and have failed to deliver. So what are you thinking, Matthew, here? I mean, the trigger being used, the union movement for a double dissolution. Will the dissolution bring a snap election, but will it deliver victory for the Liberal National Conservative government?
Oh, I think they've got some real problems. I mean, as you've identified, their lack of policy direction, and they have been quite disorganised in their development, particularly of the tax policy, which is causing them all sorts of grief, and a lot of their problems are internal. A lot of the difficulties that they're facing are to do with the right and not quite so right factions within the coalition. I think that there is no guarantee that the coalition will win this election. You'd have to start the process on the assumption that they are up and that they are. You'd have to have their odds-on favourite, but I don't think that it's any certainty. I do think the ALP has done very well. I think the policy positions, as you indicated, have put them in a very good position to look as if they have an alternative frame with which they want to take to the electorate. And they've established that early and well, while the government has been fluffing around and arguing internally about their own particular concerns. So I think they're in a good position. The gambit on the ABCC and the unions, I can't see that playing a major element in the election. If you look at all the polls, the main issue that people are concerned about are, firstly and foremost, the economy is the big issue, as it always is, followed by health and education and related issues. It's not something, the corruption issues within, or the alleged corruption within unions is not a big issue for the electorate. You only have to have a look at what happened in the Victorian election and the attempts by the coalition to paint Daniel Andrews as in the pocket of the CFMEU directly. That failed, and failed badly. It's not an issue that grabs a lot of public attention. So I don't think the election is going to be run on unions and union corruption, much as the government might like it to be.
Yeah, so. Well, I mean, the thing is that they've spent $80 million of taxpayer funds attempting to get traction on this and to turn the finger on
what have they got to show
on the
for
unions?
It? I mean, they really don't have a lot. They've got a small number of referrals to the DPP, and there are some prosecutions taking place, but a relatively small number. And the one thing that the Royal Commission didn't look at is it didn't look at corruption within the industry as a whole. It's focused specifically on one part of that industry. And the real question, and if they want to pretend, or if they want to be seen to be treating seriously the issue of corruption, not only within the building industry and more broadly, would be to build in a broad-based anti-corruption body, as has been established in many of the states. And I think this focus specifically on giving draconian powers to focus in on a particular set of workers and their union is outrageous and needs to be resisted. And hopefully the Senate will continue to reject it, and we'll see what happens after the election.
Yes, we're also seeing now at the moment that they're falling in the polls. This is, of course, the Liberal National Conservative government, and with the latest poll taken, which is the Morgan poll, has the Liberals 1 percentage point below the ALP, sitting at 49.5, and the ALP at 50.1. So that's yesterday's figure. That's an indication that there's a downward trend here against the Liberal National Conservative government. We're also seeing that there's a drop in popularity of the Prime Minister of this country, of course, Mr Malcolm Turnbull. His popularity was raging at something like 60%. We see it now at 29%. So, we're seeing that popularity, obviously, this is why they are calling for this snap election, this double D election, this to bring on greater chance before his popularity drops any further. This is the Prime Minister's popularity. That's the big concern. This is to drive the Liberals back into government, and also to the big concern is to drive them into government, but it may very well be a one-term government from what's being explained here. So let's look at it. Can we just look at the unions just at the moment? Because there's been a lot that's been spent. As we said, $80 billion has been spent of taxpayer funds chasing and perhaps to present a bloodbath for this day, which is the day before the election, because union bashing, if not Aboriginal bashing, if not refugee bashing, has won votes for the Conservative government. We only need to look back and see what John Howard did. So let's see that will it deliver is the big question. You're stating really that there's a lot of question here. In which case that looks, and the polls may continue to dive, hence the bringing in of the, calling together the Senate on the 18th of April with the view to having the May budget delivered on the 2nd of May, or the 3rd of May I should say, and the July election. So we're being squeezed into a bottleneck, so to speak, in order to save the prospects of the Liberal National Conservative government. So, but however, unions, and let's look at it, they are, obviously turning the tables. As you're saying, they're not this is not being believed by the public and population at large. What about one of the central issues in this, and that is that if you knock off the unions, if you bring in the ABCC to restrain and restrict unions, then obviously the corporations here will have greater access to the 10 million workers, that is the population at large. That's going to deliver greater profit and bigger profit for them. Is this not one of the major factors that's driving the situation?
It always has been. If you think about the impetus of the coalition and the way in which they've engaged in their politics now for decades, frankly, union bashing is an old trick, and they have pursued it every chance that they get. Partly because it's representing their constituency, which is the big end of town, for whom regulation in the workplace costs them money. It also does provide guarantees for the people who work in those institutions. So the reasons why the unions continue to pursue those issues is because our job is to represent working people and to make sure that they have proper conditions of employment and have rights and entitlements while they're at work, and can't be treated as a slave labour force.
Precisely. Now, this is what the big concern's been. That if the corporations can get to the 10 million workers, and if they start to do what they've been bringing in, which is casualisation, and of course a big issue and concern has been with minimalising wages, sweatshop wages, sweatshop conditions is where they want to drive everybody. The unions stand in the way.
Oh, that's right. And you've seen for decades a big shift away from centralised bargaining, away from centralised fixing of wages and of conditions, and a shift towards workplace control of those sorts of things. Built within that has been continual steps. Every time there is a debate about workplace relations, unions' rights and to organise and to represent people are eaten into at each part of that discussion. Now, I think that my personal view is that they've about gone as far as they can go, because we are starting to see the impacts of those policies and of that drive. The 7-Eleven workers, the ways in which you're having employers running roughshod over people's conditions, abusing them, providing them, basically cheating both the workers and the system within which they're supposed to operate. That is now becoming more and more relevant. We are starting to see a backlash against insecure employment. There's been a long shift towards insecure employment. I think that those dynamics are going to change over the few years to come. I don't accept the view that we are moving towards a 24/7 economy where everybody has to be available for their employers every minute of every day. I think there is a bounce back coming against those sorts of things, and hopefully we'll see some of the industrial regulation shifting in that way as well.
Yes, well, what about rights here, Gerrit? I mean, we're dealing with the Constitution. What about the rights of workers? What about the ILO, the International Labour Organisations? How do we address the and prevent ourselves from being, according to the Constitution, that is, and other laws, from being sweat-shopped for profits for major corporations?
Well, the framers of the Constitution debated at length about unions, and they recognised that sometimes unions have to be restrained, but they also recognised that unions are necessary for a lot of people to be protected. They in fact created that the federal government could deal with federal union problems, and including then the waterside workers, because they held that was under federal, and then the other matters would fall under the state legislation. Regretfully, the states have been passing on industrial relations to the Commonwealth, which undermines what really was intended. Unions, because the framers of the Constitution recognise that you need to protect those who are vulnerable by employers. One of the things is that the Constitution, if I can come back to the coming double dissolution, the Constitution was created that the Senate would be a house of review, which would have senators elected on the interest of the states, whereas the House of Reps is elected on the basis of the Commonwealth as being one entity. What we now have the problem is that Mr. Malcolm Turnbull, who has been favouring the bully programs through school, is now the biggest bully by forcing the Senate to comply basically with his demands. Now, he says, look, that above the square is unfair, we have to reorganise that. Well, the thing is that the above the squares was
above the
line squares voting. The point is this, they can simply delete that and go back to the original way as like they do the House of Reps. And they can say, okay, look, if you don't want to fill in 100 squares, if you only fill in 20, then that will count, then you just fill in. Now, a lot more independents might then get elected because people will be willing to do that. They may not want to fill in 100 squares. Or if we do it in sections like they do in the state election, they divide the states in 3 or 4 parts, and then you vote for a number. That reduces it also. My concern is with Malcolm Turnbull now, with his double dissolution issue. If he wants to call an election on the 2nd of July, he would have to get the budget for the 1st of July commencing to be passed. If those senators who are now standing to lose their seats with a double dissolution decide they're not going to go vote for this budget on the 3rd of May or thereafter, and they will tell him, look, we will vote for the budget on the 12th of May, but that is too late for Malcolm Turnbull to call a double dissolution. He then has a choice. He either won't go ahead with double dissolution, or he has to call an election that the election is held before the 1st of July, because without the budget, but technically on the 1st of July then, the country stopped financially. Sure, the Governor General has the inherent powers as the Chief Executive Officer of the Commonwealth to authorise payments, but he can only do that really for necessary expenditure like running the departments, paying pension, everything else. And then if a new Parliament is elected, they can then authorise that be backed up. But we have a problem here that Mr. Malcolm Turnbull is trying to undermine the intentions of the framers of the Constitution to give unions their rights, because the frame of the Constitution, union right is governed by the state. That's what they were made clear. And if you look at my website or my blog, you will find I've quoted the frame of the Constitution, what they said about the unions, about contract dealings. And I do believe that people who are forced to work in weekends, right, that they should have a compensation for that. I'm retired, so it's not going to affect me, so it's not that I'm biased in that, but I do believe that people who are called out on special hours, they may incur huge transport costs, they may have to get somebody else to drive them because there is no public transport maybe to where they have to work. Those kind of people should be compensated for working out of, let's say, 9 to 5 jobs. And I do believe that that was the intention of the framers of the Constitution when I've researched their debates, that the unions are there to protect their rights.
So rights need to be protected. I mean, obviously, but very interesting the point that was raised, and that is that the states have responsibility for the rights of unions. It's not a federal national control over that. I mean, where does that leave us, Matthew? I mean, in terms of the rights and responsibilities, and we're looking at the changes that were brought in by the Howard government and also too by the ALP.
I think the reality is, while the framers of the Constitution certainly did have in their heads that the states were the primary location for regulation of employment, over the years that has shifted, and it's been not a simple process. It's not simply the transfer of powers that have occurred, for example, in Victoria to the federal government. There has been a process of shifting by the creation of cross-border disputes to generate national disputes, and national regulation has occurred over many years. Awards were often created through artificial interstate disputes, which then allowed the Commonwealth to have authority over trying to regulate that. And increasingly, most workers, or many workers, have been shifting for decades into the federal sphere. So it's not a straightforward question of shifting it back to the states. I think that's unlikely, just simply because we now have so much of our economy operates across the borders.
Yes, indeed. It's becoming more centralised, really.
Just take the simple question of a train driver who's driving from WA to South Australia. As soon as they cross the border, they could be under different conditions of employment. That becomes a real trick and problem. So some equalisation was inevitable as Australia became less a federation of states and more of a unitary entity as it is now.
Yeah, but the big concern here, and Dr. Kogel, I might ask you about this, but in terms of governance, but the issue to do with centralising power is of major concern. Particularly if there's now a greater push. Well, privatisation has pretty much removed the powers of the state. They've sold out their powers. They've sold them to corporations. So we're seeing that with that, the states are losing power. They're losing control, no matter who we elect at the state election level. Control on the agenda. We saw that just happen just recently with the Minister for Public Transport when we had the trouble with the trams. Say, well, it's not my responsibility. Actually, you need to speak to Yarra Trams about this. We're seeing this more and more. In other words, so we're seeing that centralisation of power, is that a threat against democracy? Is privatisation a threat of democracy? Is this not time to review all of that, given the fact that with the union rights and powers and with the attack on unions, perhaps part of the strategy might be to wrestle out of the control of the national level, put it back at the state level, put it back under state governments, and also to privatisation in terms of the economics of the state, of governments, the disempowerment, the killing off of democracy through privatisation. This surely comes under review at this point in time as we struggle to find solution and to really to fight back for our rights, and to have, I think, greater participation by the public at large in the electoral processes.
I think that final point that you've closed on there is really crucial. That what we've seen in Australia ever since federation is what's been termed a centralising federation, where power has gravitated more and more to the central government level, to the national government level, and that's been at the expense of people living in the states and in local communities within the states to have reasonable democratic say over the conditions and the services and the facilities, the infrastructure, if you like, that's provided for them. And what we're seeing many, many countries of the world now is a lot more attention to ways of empowering local communities to make decisions over the things that they need for their own decent standards of living, the sorts of services they're provided with, sorts of facilities they're provided with, the sort of infrastructure, whether it's rail or road or shipping or whatever it might be. All of those things have been eroded, and as you point out, a significant amount of the erosion has been states giving up powers over facilities through privatisation. A colleague of mine at Monash University, Professor Graham Hodge, has pointed out that the effect of privatisation, in fact, is to cost the community more. So on average, it costs about 2% more to finance something through privatisation than it does through the state, or for that matter federal government providing it, but through government provision. And the reason for that's pretty straightforward when you think about it. The reality is that because governments are much more stable and much more secure financially, and they can raise taxes, they are able to borrow for a lesser interest rate than a private company which doesn't have taxation powers, which relies on the market for its revenue, and basically is in a much weaker position than virtually any government. So it's extraordinarily rare for a government to default on a payment. But if you look just within Australia at the things like Dick Smith, where the company collapsed and is in the point of closing down all of their shops, you just don't see that sort of thing happening for any government agencies in Australia. They are secure, they are able to continue operating the services, they're continuing to be able to borrow money at reasonable interest rates to improve their facilities or services, or to construct new infrastructure and what have you. And I was just going to.
I
was just going to give you a more immediate example. Well, certainly for me as a union official in an education union, look at the TAFE sector. Look at what's happening in TAFE, where you've got all of these shonky providers, some of them very large companies, who have been delivering TAFE programs to the community, and they've been doing it in very shonky ways. They're taking government money to do things that were previously paid for by internal processes. So we've seen the privatisation of TAFE, and we've seen enormous rip-offs and rorts occurring within that. The taxpayer has been worse off, the students who have been enrolling in these programs are worse off, and the community at large is worse off. The whole process was a disaster. And unfortunately, we're going to be living with that disaster. While it'll get reined in, we'll be living with that disaster for generations to come.
Well, there we are. I mean, this is like the public themselves. I mean, we're not only paid for a Royal Commission into the unions, $80 million, but I mean, here we are, we're paying for these private corporations to get greater advantage, but they're not delivering better. They're not delivering better outcomes in these spheres right across the whole of government that we had before we privatised. So privatisation really needs to be burnt. The contracts need to be reversed. It sounds it is possible. We saw the Andrews government when they came to power just recently at the state level here, that they tore up the East-West link because the public demanded it, because the public did not want to proceed in that direction. It was one of the most expensive links, $18 billion all up, $1 billion a kilometre. The Andrews government saved $17 billion for the Victorian population at large, and was able to reinvest that. Now, surely this is the time and the climate to end the experiment on privatisation. It's disempowered the public and the people. We've become bait, you might say, user-paid bait for corporations. It's fed the corporations, and it feeds much into what's being debated at the moment, and that is Lenore Taylor's discussions and her position recently, as well as many others I know, on the neoliberal policies, that they've really hit the brick wall. It's really the end. It's really time to review. It's time to review privatisation, deregulation, globalisation, these sorts of principles, because we're seeing that they're actually not working, although these seem to be the policies of the Turnbull government. So the Turnbull government is committed to the policies, but we're seeing that within the union sphere and within society and the economics of at the state level and at the federal level of the country, that they are an abysmal failure. They've got to be terminated immediately. We need to start the action on that, do we not? Particularly now that we've got an election coming up.
Well, I think we can take a lot of comfort from the response of the Labor Party to that. And some of your viewers may remember that Jenny Macklin and Bill Shorten released their document Growing Together just a week or two ago. And what that document does is it recognises that the economic model of the 80s and the 90s has failed, and doing more of the same is in fact going to make things worse rather than resolve the sorts of problems that Australia has and the other economies which have adopted neoliberal policies have. So that what Leonora Taylor was pointing out is that those sort of economic theories which led to privatisation and managerialism in the public service and what have you, have in fact not produced what they promised and have failed. And as Matthew's pointed out, when it comes to the case of TAFE, they've failed spectacularly, and failed not only because they haven't delivered the nature and quality of services that the community needs, as well as the individual young people need, but they've also exposed the greed and avarice of the people who've been running many of these privatised operations. And here you had the appalling spectacle of people who'd taken hundreds of thousands of dollars from students doing TAFE courses and taken $10 million each into a private account from their provider. Now, that is just appalling behaviour by any standard, and I, for one, just cannot understand the level of greed that leads people to do that, knowing that they are stealing money, and not only stealing money, but stealing the future of the young people who were doing these courses which they thought would set them up for life in a career. But instead of that, they've had their futures robbed.
Yes,
Not
indeed.
only that, they're just one of my favourite topics, this one. They are still, you end up with students at the end of it with a HECS debt and without any qualifications, because the colleges themselves collapse. You don't get a diploma, you don't get the process, the qualification that you were seeking, you end up with a large debt. And the way in which you got convinced to do that is someone knocked on your door, offered you an iPad to sign this piece of paper, and people are ending up having their lives destroyed, as you say. It's an appalling process.
Yes, it is indeed. And let's just look at it.
Process.
Let's just look at that. I mean, it is appalling. It all opened with the door opened with the grey suits, the briefcase, and the checkbook. The checkbook brought out the assets of the nation under our constitution, of course, and under public control, under public policy, and the power of the empowerment of the public. And therefore, of course, that we've lost that. It's been sold into the hands of private providers, into multinational corporations. They have not been able to deliver. We're hearing endless stories. We need terminations of those contracts. We need practical remedy. And the problem here, and Gerrit, I'll get your view on this, that is that the corporations have walked in the door. So corporations have not been democratically elected, and yet they're sitting in the seat of power. We're seeing that at the moment with the National Commission of Audit. We're seeing that with, of course, they scripted together the 2014 budget. We're also seeing as well the ACCI or CCCI, the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and their views have been sought now on pensions, and that pensions are to become a loan in the future. We're seeing this shift and this move out of our democratic formula and pattern and democratic laws. So what they are proposing is everything outside the law, that they are seeing themselves as above the law. We've included into our economy and running our government and our governance corporations. They've not been democratically elected. They sit in our cabinet. They're writing up all the documents and all the policies. They've got a large control on our ATO, the Australian Tax Office. Surely this is a breach of the Constitution, is it not?
It's a breach of the constitutional principles. What Kent just said, that hits me hard, because actually I just know of a case where a person was studying and suddenly the company went liquidated. All those students lose everything there. They're working hard to achieve something, and suddenly the company is liquidated with millions of debts. So I can understand what Ken is saying, and this is why we have to go back to our principle of the Constitution. the framers of the Constitution made clear we should have responsible ministers. In fact, they were saying that the minister either would have to run the trucks from Telecom, what was then Telecom, whatever, Australian Post, right? You don't see ministers being that responsible anymore. What ministers are doing, they get into the parliament for photo opportunities, and then they say, well, we now give it over to a private company. They run it. If they make mistakes, I'm not responsible. We couldn't. This is our constitutional principle, to have responsible ministers. They have to be responsible to the people. We don't need that ministers now privatize everything to get away from the responsibility. But when something goes all right, the minister is there to make photo opportunities and kissing babies. We should say to the ministers, listen, you're getting paid to do a job, you better do it. And no longer privatization. We have to get it back under the responsibility of the minister. Then we can avoid a lot, because this is what the concept of the Constitution was about. And regretfully, we have this more and more undermined, which I think both you, Matthew, and Ken is about. And I hope that the people in this election will say, listen, we want to go back to the original structure of our Constitution. We can do it. We can do it by simply spending some time to fill in the ballot paper. And how much time will it take out of 3 years that you have an election? If you do that, you put your choice on there, preferable maybe the independents first, then you may see that you give a message to those political parties and say, listen, if you don't do what we want, then you're out.
Yeah, and all this is framed on policies. So let's look at it. According to the Constitution, corporations being involved in our government and governance, they're not democratically elected, and they've certainly not been sworn into our executive, which is our public service, and they don't sit in the judicial, and neither should they. These are the major core components of our Constitution, and Section 44(1) of the Constitution writes them out. As a matter of fact, and they are to be removed. Anyone who is not sworn in and does not lay aside all of their vested interests, pecuniary interests and conflict of interest in order to serve the public with public policy. So that is policy that's in the interest of the public and for the betterment of the public. So we're seeing here, listeners, that we're talking about issues where we see enormous abuse, a travesty of justice, enormous wrong, and we're looking at a system to be able to correct it. But it's being occupied, the system's being occupied, and policies coming out are against the public and becoming more fractured, so to speak, more chaos under this government, which is the Liberal National Conservative Turnbull government. Now, here, Dr. Kogel, let's look at it. We've got various levels of corruption that are creeping in. Obviously, we're saying the best way to correct the corruption is to get the instigators out and to get out the breaches of the walls of the Constitution. That is, get corporations out, get them into industry where they belong. They have not been democratically elected, therefore they don't sit, and even focus groups as well don't sit within our government to make decision making. So we've got a treasury, we've got a public service by which to deliver this. So therefore, if we see the need, therefore, so obviously privatisation and ending that is the key way to go. Getting rid of corporations out of our government is the way to go. The other way that you've mentioned too is to bring in the anti-corruption commissions. Now, we've had untold numbers of cases as well of snout in the trough by various politicians, and we're seeing as well that the issues of vested interest, pecuniary interest, conflict of interest are there as well. Particularly, for example, with our Prime Minister, Mr. Turnbull, he's an investor in 7-Eleven, and yet we've seen the greatest abuse of workers in 7-Eleven. I mean, what is this saying when we've got members of our Parliament that are also involved in property management, property control, multiple properties, getting advantage of negative gearing? Every one of them has, at the national level, has 2, 3, 4, 5 properties each, some variations of all of that. Is that not conflict of interest? How many multiple hats, and are they working toward vested interest? They're working for their own interest and not for the interest of the people and the public of the nation. So the Anti-Corruption Commission, will that eliminate it? We are looking for solutions here.
Look, I think there's several really important points that you've raised there, Sharon. And I suppose I'd start by going back to the recommendations for codes of practice for parliaments that I developed for the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association published about 9 months or so ago. And the basic principle which it starts from is exactly the point raised by Gerrit. That is that every member of Parliament, and ministers even more so, have a responsibility to act in the public interest and must not act in their personal interest or any other private interest. So this is the public trust principle, as it's termed. It's right there in the Constitution. Effectively, it goes back to Magna Carta, 800 years old, or nearly 801 years old now. And that basic principle makes it very, very clear that if you hold a position of responsibility for some public activity, you have to put that ahead of any other interest whatsoever. And here we've got ministers who are running a million miles when you've got someone like these private TAFE providers going to the wall. It should be the minister standing up and saying, I accept responsibility for what has gone on under the contract or under the legislation for which I am responsible, and I, the minister, am going to make sure that it's fixed up. And if I can't fix it, then I'm clearly incompetent and I'll have to resign. But that's the basic principle that should be at play here. And that's the sort of thing which I see recognised in this government growing together document. What the Labor Party has recognised is that those economic policies of the 80s and the 90s may have seemed good at the time, but they haven't worked, they haven't produced the goods. And what we've got to do is to go back to the basic principle which accepts that the government and ministers and members of parliament are responsible and accountable for what they do, and going along with that, accept all of the abundant evidence that looking after the poor and the weak in any community is going to make for a stronger community. Now, with the neoliberal policies that we've seen over the last few decades, that's concentrated power and wealth in the hands of increasingly small numbers of people. So the wealthy have become more wealthy, but society has not progressed as a consequence of that. Society, in fact, has been going backwards, with more people in the community being unable to look after themselves as they should be able to in a wealthy country like Australia, unable to access the sorts of health services that is available to wealthy people here in Australia, and unable to access the quality education that should be available in every school, because again it's gravitating to the well-endowed schools, both well-endowed public schools and the expensive privately owned schools, private schools. So there's a whole lot of things here which have gone off the rails over the last 2 or 3 decades, and Labor has recognised that. Malcolm Turnbull is still stuck with the hard right people in his own party dictating more of the same failed policies.
Yes, indeed. Well, we're seeing the very point, and that is that Mr. Turnbull himself is the BRW rich list. He's perhaps the first known stated BRW rich listed Prime Minister that we've got, and that's a concern because wealth and profit is their objective, and that runs surely against the grain of what a social democratic country is, a democracy. And we're talking about the big shifts and changes here with America, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. The Commonwealth nations have come under enormous attack. And we can state clearly from the 2014 budget that there's been a mass assault on the public at large, an attempt to hamstring and to wrestle down the unions who've been our great fighters in the past for the rights of all common Australians. Hence, that's why there's $80 million of taxpayer funds cast upon them to restrain them. The ABCC, which is going to be like a worker police, and it's not just for the unions, it's also for the workers, the 10 million workers that the corporations are attempting to get their fingers and claws into. And so, we're seeing this shift and we're seeing the change. So we've got the big concern, the vested interest, pecuniary interest, conflict of interest. It's been arisen time and time again here in the political and economic landscape. And of course, too, we're seeing that the social fabric is starting to play out with 2.5 million people in poverty. We're seeing 105 homeless on any one given night. These sorts of statistics we have not seen in Australia since we federated in 1901. And as a matter of fact, these are of large concern. As we're saying, the way forward is to really start to look at the inequality issues and answer the question, why have we got people in poverty? And we must see there that, Matthew, the equation of jobs, employment, we're seeing too that people are having to work 3-4 jobs in order to just rake in enough to survive, and the cost of living. So, this is the bed of nails we're being cast upon, but the public are going to get off the bed of nails, are they not? And of course they are. And we've got an election coming up in 2016.
I just want to come back to where we started, which is the question about the role of the ABCC and the way in which the government is using that to frame an election campaign. One thing that most people, I think, don't have a real deep understanding of how unions actually operate, and that's one of the problems that we've got. People don't understand that actually unions are a very democratic organisation. Taking our union as an example, we operate, our primary decision-making body is our National Council, and that meets every year, and there are delegates who are elected through the Electoral Commission in each one of the workplaces that we are represented in, and they then are sent to this meeting of 150, 180 people who make all of the policy decisions of the union. The people who sit around the National Executive, who runs the union in between national councils, are people who are elected to jobs within the union either as state secretaries or as rank and file members who are delegates to that conference. So it is made up of a combination of those people. As an organisation, we are highly democratic. Now, the role, if you think about the role of the ABCC and what the government is attempting to do with that, if you apply the same sort of idea to a union like the CFMEU, who is clearly the union that is the key target of the ABCC, there are other unions that are impacted as well, but that's their primary target. What that's saying is it's trying to put an onus upon ordinary rank and file workers who get engaged with the union, who don't necessarily have a legal background, who don't have a long history of industrial engagement. They are rank and file members who've been elected to a job on behalf of their people in their workplace. And we are putting obligations on them, and they are trying to argue similar obligations for those people as they apply to CEOs and boards in companies. There's been an argument that similar penalties should apply to union delegates and to union officials as apply to people who run corporations. It's just an absurdity.
Yes.
And the problem with the ABCC is, even if you accept the government's primary position, which is that there is corruption within the building industry, and that the union is at the heart of that, and that therefore there needs to be an anti-corruption body to deal with it, the ABCC does not have that authority. It simply, it does not have an anti-corruption remit. That is still the responsibility of the police in the relevant states and the federal police. So even on their own terms, the ABCC does not do what it is they are pretending that it's there to do. If they were serious about corruption in the building industry and anywhere else, what they'd be doing is they'd be setting up a broad-based anti-corruption organisation that could allow an independent oversight of the way in which not only unions operate, but the corporations and other organisations that function within that within that industry are occurring. It would be a much fairer process, and it wouldn't just be an exercise in trying to beat up a section of the workforce that, frankly, is just trying to look after the people that it's there to represent.
Yes, precisely. So we're seeing that, this beating up unions is, we've got an election coming. And if you're not beating up unions, we're beating up Aboriginal people, we're beating up, and that it builds racism, asylum seekers build fear. This is what leads to the campaign and to obviously to electing the Liberal National Conservative government in. They've driven these sorts of campaigns many times in order to get re-elected. But I think it's rotting on the vine now. I think people aren't falling for this type of tactic. And I think that, as you're saying, people are wanting the truth. What we've seen is fraudulent activity on behalf of the government. If it's not bringing in that false report that came in, then which is a false report or a style report, an old stale report, when the ALP were putting negative gearing on the table to scare everyone. And still using those scare tactics in order to drive down the public's acceptance of the negative gearing policy direction of the ALP. And their proposal was to place negative gearing on new build homes. It would create employment opportunities. It would also create opportunity for first home buyers, etc. So they're using stale material, irrelevant material, the shrapnel report. was to be condemned and spat upon because it was irrelevant. It was a fake and fraudulent document put on the table by the Liberal National Conservative government that had no relevance whatsoever, and Mr Turnbull and his government needs to be condemned for that type of malpractice. At the same time, $80 million being put on unions to stranglehold them when they're acting democratically and within the law, according to the Constitution, to protect the rights of workers, their wages and pay. And to bring a falsified ABCC, as you've just said, upon the people, which would be like a Stasi-style police on the workers themselves, 10 million workers. And I think a part of that's already been in operation by this Turnbull government. And that is when a worker is even being policed after work as to what social media sites they're on after work. Now, I believe that that's like a Stasi-style secret police that has no place in a democracy. So we need to start to shift the agenda, and I think that we're starting to shift it. Now, we're saying we've got to end privatisation, that we need to start to also end, sham contracting as well. We need to have major reforms within the union issues and the union movement. We're having to see, we've got to get rid of corporations outside of government. It has no place. They're not democratically elected. They have no right to be there. And we need to start to change according to the discussion that's occurring, the Lenore-Taylor type discussion, that we need to start to look at putting the budget and putting the dollars into the pockets of the majority of the workers and the public and the people. That's where the wealth of the nation is going to come from, is not through bringing in cuts and cutbacks to education, bringing in false providers like shonky sham operators that all they're doing is that they should be subjected to white-collar crime like the banks and the financial advisors within the banks, and there should be an investigation and a royal commission into them. And also we need to have that provision here to protect the public at large, which is the issue to do with having a national anti-corruption commission to bring into order the recalcitrant politicians that we have. And we need the public as well alive to be able to bring cases to the High Court, as well as we need to have crowdfunding for a number of issues, and the Office of the Guardian to be instigated as well, so that people can walk off the street and walk into the Office of the Guardian to represent them on issues and to get some direction as to where they can get help and assistance according to the Constitution. So we've got a lot that's driving us at the moment. We've got a lot that's on the table. Here we are putting issues on the table, policies on the table. We see nothing placed on the table by the Turnbull government. This is what's wrong, and we're heading into an election. So what we need to do is that we need to, the public need to get armed, geared, active, and also too, as we see them, we need a lot of the restraints pulled off. We need to get out of centralisation of powers here that the Turnbull government, I think, is trying to fast track, and also to try to railroad us into an election that is an election that is a snap election, and start to, as we're saying here, get active in the way by which we vote, and also to the way by which we take up issues. Let's look at what the unions are doing. We might just close on these few points, but the unions actually, they've gone on strike before Christmas, the Easter break, I should say. That we've got the CPSU that's taking action across a whole range of areas, a whole range of work. Here we see also privatisation occurring, whether we're talking the public sector, the tax office, the CSIRO. These have been privatised, elements of them are being privatised, going right back into industry itself. So is this part of the process? I mean, the public actually taking the issues up and fighting for their rights, campaigning the rights, and that these issues, do you see them running into the election?
I've got no doubt that the campaign that's going on with the CPSU and the federal government is going to be ongoing. I can't see that being resolved before the election's over. I think part of the problem there, of course, is the government is setting unrealistic expectations on the workers. They're asking to take conditions away from people as part of the settlement of their collective agreement. And the union is doing the right thing. They're trying to stand up for the people that are members of the union, and they're trying to look after their conditions of employment. I can't see this being quickly resolved, to be honest with you. I think while this government is in place, they're going to be very reluctant, particularly with the right wing of the party flexing its muscles at every opportunity, they're going to be very reluctant to show any movement on the government's position before the election.
And Dr. Kogel, your final comment on the election process.
Look, the election process is, of course, dependent on what the Senate does with the ABCC bill. I'm confident that the independent senators and Labor will hold strong on that because of the principle which they are upholding, and I certainly hope that they introduce amendments for a National Crime Control Commission and make that the centre point of debate. So if at the end of that process that bill is defeated and becomes a double dissolution trigger, then I think it's a huge gamble by Malcolm Turnbull, and Malcolm Turnbull is running a very severe risk that he'll be defeated and Bill Shorten will be the Prime Minister on the 3rd of July.
Yes, indeed. And your final comment just regarding the constitution and legal battles ahead of us?
Well, Mr. Howe, he was a delegate to the conventions for over 8 years, and one of the basic issues he was raising was that people should not be left on the streets as paupers. We should have a society that cares. The unions, in fact, are doing that in many ways to fight for low-income earners, that they have a basic wage and everything else. That's why we have in the Constitution about pensions and disabled, because Mr. Howe was fighting for that. Regretfully, we have now a federal government that doesn't seem to understand or not wanting to understand the basic principles in our Constitution of having a caring society. And we have to consider this. If we didn't have the unions, where would be the basic wage? People would be depending on whatever the companies would say. So I would urge people to consider that. We have a very valuable, beautiful constitution which you ought to really research and understand, and then you find that what the unions are doing is in broadly exactly what the constitution intention was. Yes, some people in the unions have misbehaved, so to say, in a wrong manner, but that happens in the government, that happens in private companies. So don't judge the entire union for what a few may have done wrong, as much as you don't judge the entire people in parliament or the entire people in private companies for what a few may do. So I urge people to appreciate the Constitution and to get back on the government and say, listen, we have a Constitution that is to provide for the poor, the weak, etc. Let us do that.
Yes, indeed. So we've got a snap election poll being forced upon us. We've got deadlines. We've got a meeting in Parliament. But it's the determination of the outcome lay with the people and with the public. And they will determine who snaps into government, not when we will be snapped into an election by the Turnbull government. It's important the outcome, and it's important that we address the issues. And the public and the people are the ones to fight, and to fight for the direction, and to fight for the nation, and to fight for the future. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Look at the front line of our struggle. The black youth are